20th Century Studios presents Bad things will start to happen. Evil things. A film of psychological suspense about an occurrence of earth-shaking importance.
It's false.
You must be very careful. They can boast the Antichrist. The first omen. Listen to me, Mother. Don't be afraid, Mother. He chose you, Mother. If this is the truth, where does it end? The first omen.
Naming the Antichrist, the history of an American obsession. Author Robert Fuller. In this back cover book report, before going into details on this historical rending on naming the Antichrist, I'd like to name the top 5 cinema Antichrist films, and this is from the website Dread Central. The Devil. The top 5 cinema Antichrist films. 5. The Omen. Is there any better film to start this list than with The Omen? Damien Thorne is the true embodiment of the Antichrist character. Even his name became synonymous with the creature. Damien's influence transcended horror films and became a part of mainstream society, as it was common to hear an unruly child referred to as Damien, insinuating the little brat pitching a fit in the Walmart toy section because he couldn't get a new WWE action figure might indeed be the son of Old Scratch himself. The original film from 1976 was created on a budget of less than $3 million and would go on to gross over $60 million and spawn several sequels, a remake, and nightmares aplenty. Number 4, The Devil's Advocate. Better to rule in hell than to serve in heaven. This line from the 17th century poet John Milton's iconic work Paradise Lost is directly quoted in The Devil's Advocate to Al Pacino's character. Number 3, Prince of Darkness. Number 2, Fear No Evil. Rosemary's Baby. And from another webpage naming off a top 10 movie films about the same theme, without going into too much detail. Holocaust 2000, 1977. The Vatican Tapes, 2015. Final Conflict, that is Omen 3, 1981. Omen 2, Damien, 1978. When Evil Lurks, 2023. The Devil's Advocate, 1997. Angel Heart, 1987. In 1968 was Rosemary's Baby. And of course, previously mentioned on the other site, Prince of Darkness, 1987, and The Omen, which originally the first film was released in 1976. And I opened up this particular segment with a soundbite from The First Omen, which will be released April 5th, 2024. And of course, I would say that there are innumerable other films that have been released on the subject of the devil, Antichrist, and evil incarnate, so to speak, and not to mention the Exorcist films, which all basically carry the same theme. And Robert C. Fuller could, mentioned it was an obsession. We could readily say that it is an American obsession. About the author, Robert C. Fuller, and this is from Wikipedia, born 1952, is the caterpillar of Professor of Religious Studies at Bradley University, specializing in religion and psychology and contemporary religion in America. Fuller is author of 13 books, including Mesmerism and the American Cure of Souls, Spiritual but Not Religious, Understanding Unchurched America, 2001, and The Body of Faith, A Biological History of Religion in America, 2013. So, it's safe to say that Robert Fuller is fully qualified in his research. The History of an American Obsession, naming the Antichrist. Now, before giving a description of this material in the back cover book report, I would like to refer you to The Fallacies of Premillennial Dispensationalist Eschatology, a previous post, and if you could, to get more perspective, the Kingdom Bible Study series on the Antichrist and what or whom it is or could be. Now, depending upon the lens you're viewing this material, there are variations on who or what Antichrist or the Antichrist is, or could be, or will be. There's a Catholic perspectives, and there's various Christian Protestant perspectives. There are also Jewish perspectives and Muslim perspectives. Whether or not Antichrist would be Roman or Muslim, depending on which school of thought you are speculating upon. And these are the three major views from literal futurist, fundamentalist types of schools of thought. There's a proposed fourth view, the allegorical, spiritual, symbolic view, which would say that Antichrist is a collective ego of humanity, which with an anti-God, anti-biblical, anti-Christ tendency. This is the symbolic view, and it's prevalent throughout Scripture, mankind being the first Adam, which rebelled in the Garden of Eden, rather than that of the second Adam, Christ. Which would, the symbolic view would be necessitating the spirit of Cain as prevalent in the book of Genesis. So with that view, you could say that Antichrist has always been from the beginning and not necessarily a future dictator or political world government leader as depicted in the Left Behind theologies, which is primarily fictional. That said, I think it's safe to say that this particular book, naming the Antichrist, The History of an American Obsession, is a good place to start if one is to decipher fact from fiction and truth from error. Throughout the history of Christian beliefs and the forging of its plethora of creeds, denominations, and diverse array of doctrines, the idea of a spiritual war took shape. A war between good and evil, God and Satan, Christ and Antichrist. Unknown to many, it's this same dualistic concept that emerges long before Christianity became one of the largest religions in the world. This concept of the dualism as well as the non-dual are inherent, at least within the five main spiritual traditions, with each tradition having its own concepts of good versus evil. And with that, I'd like to refer you to a previous post entitled Christian Enemy Number 1, Dualism. It's been the deeper spiritual path that has brought up the teachings of non-duality or non-dualism, and which has been largely neglected by its exoteric orthodox fundamentalist counterparts. So in Christian history, more specifically American Christian history, this hard substance dualism took shape dating back to pre-colonial times. The results from approximately 1776 to present have been often failed attempts to literally pin the tail on an or the Antichrist. This dualism was also prevalent in Gnosticism and Zoroastrianism long before Christianity came into its forefront. So attempts to identify and pinpoint this presumed man of sin have been prevalent since the beginning of the emergence of Christianity itself, which has unfortunately pitted one Christian denomination against another. For example, Protestants believe that Catholicism is Antichrist in its nature, vice versa. At least what one perceived or attempted to identify as characteristics of an Antichrist, or even perhaps project onto and or demonize another. Many individuals also throughout history have been named as the Antichrist. Or for that matter, to dehumanize an individual to the status of evil incarnate, in a sense, absolutizing evil. A person possessed by Satan, the devil. That is the concept of the fiction. This dualism is deeply ingrained in the psyche of millions, and we can readily witness its effects in pop culture and entertainment. So they have deliberately blurred the lines between fact and fiction. Most recently, with the release of the horror film Exorcist Believer, and soon to be released prequel to the Omen franchise entitled The First Omen. People's fascination with evil incarnate has not subsided. You can call it an obsession, an American obsession, but the question, theologically speaking, considering the track record of this literal doctrine of evil and or Antichrist, is this obsession even grounded in a solution to the problem of evil? Or is it perpetuating it? By emphasizing a substance dualism? In my opinion, after reading this book, Naming the Antichrist, The History of an American Obsession, it's been an unhealthy obsession when we dehumanize our fellow humans and absolutize evil in order to project upon or become another for having different beliefs from our own. Evil is not, nor ever will be, as absolute as this dualistic doctrine has proposed we believe in. For centuries, the Christian tradition has struggled with the problem of evil, but then so have other traditions in their own ways. We think that we can deal more honestly with the problem of evil if we put a face to it, and perhaps in pop culture is a way to face the evil that we fear most. What better way than to say and absolutize it as Satan possessing one person? But it turns out the dynamics of evil and the mystery of iniquity itself isn't so easily pinned down. Otherwise, by now, I'm sure we would have. And is more complex, perhaps, than mere fictions can afford. Left Behind and Omen theology might be quite entertaining, but whether or not they merit any actual grounding in prophecy and biblical eschatology, it is doubtful. In order to further access this, we must ask ourselves with historical insight into this particular obsession with evil and the false ideas which were fostered out of this obsession. What obsession? Naming the Antichrist. That said, at present, scholars across the board will not or cannot agree on whom or what Antichrist actually is. Although they read and study the same Holy Bible. And from the back cover of this book, lively reading, disturbingly fresh and provocative, New York Times. In Naming the Antichrist, Robert Fuller takes us on a fascinating journey through the dark side of the American religious psyche, from the earliest American colonists right up to contemporary fundamentalists such as Pat Robertson and Hal Lindsey. Further, Fuller begins by offering a brief history of the idea of the Antichrist and its origins in the apocalyptic thought of the Judeo-Christian tradition, and traces the eventual migration of the Antichrist legend across the Atlantic. He shows how the colonists saw Antichrist personified in everyone from Native Americans to the Church of England. He looks at the Great Second Awakening in the early 19th century, showing how such prominent Americans as Yale President Timothy Dwight saw the work of Satan in phenomena ranging from the French Revolution to Masonry. In the 20th century, he finds a startling array of hate mongers, such as the Ku Klux Klan, who drew on apocalyptic imagery in their attacks on Jews, Catholics, blacks, socialists, and others. Finally, he considers the contemporary fundamentalist writers such as Hal Lindsey and a host of others who have found Antichrist in the sinister guise of the European Economic Community, in feminism, and even supermarket barcodes and fiber optics. And I would say the obsession continues, as we can probably list the COVID-19 vaccine being one of the latest, or President Donald Trump naming the Antichrist. So what is wrong with that picture? Can we clearly pin this down? I would say no. Continuing, throughout, Fuller reveals in vivid detail how our unique American obsession with the Antichrist reflects the struggle to understand ourselves and our enemies within the mythic context of the battle of absolute good versus absolute evil. From Salem witch trials to the evil empire, from Cotton Mather to Pat Robertson, Fuller traces a succession of zealots ready to defend Christian civilization against evil incarnate. From Los Angeles Times Book Review, clearly written and astute, the Boston Sunday Globe, fascinating and especially timely work, and I would say yes, as the next release of the Omen franchise is due tomorrow to be released on April 5th, and this is April 4th. Fuller offers cogent psychological and sociological explanations for the hold of the idea of the Antichrist upon the American imagination. Robert C. Fuller is professor of religious studies at Bradley University. Now, going into depth of the material, I'd like to point out some things that stood out as I read this particular book. Quote, "The entanglement of Jews with the Second Coming has had profound consequences for Americans' attitude toward foreign policy and in particular toward the modern nation of Israel. Students of Bible prophecy have known for centuries that the entire end-time scenario hinges on the existence of a restored Jewish state in Palestine. Without such a restored Israel, the day of triumph and revenge will never come. Premillennialism consequently gave rise to what might be called Protestant Zionism, the intensely pro-Israel stance among precisely those richest or rightist, right-wing Protestants who, in other contexts, were anti-Semitic within history. Prominent dispensationalists such as William Blackstone assumed leadership in the advocacy of Zionism and were jubilant at every step, leading to the final creation of Israel in 1948. Such commitment to Bible prophecy, incidentally, has on many occasions tempered or even wholly eliminated anti-Semitism among premillennialist Christians. Winrod Smith and McIntyre all at one time or another publicly denounce anti-Semitism, as do most fundamentalist leaders today. Such pro-Israeli settlements and public disclaimers of any anti-Semitism, notwithstanding, however, premillennialist belief is inherently laden with condescension and prejudice. Judgments about Jews are not made on the grounds of just or moral reasons, but on whether Bible prophecy is being confirmed. For example, Israel's persistent militarism and its inhumane treatment of Palestinians have been tactily endorsed as integral to the fulfillment of Bible prophecy. But these kinds of judgments cut both ways. Over and beyond being rejectors of Christ, Jews are in the final analysis not really persons to be understood or valued in their own right. They are pawns in God's salvation history, a history that assigns them significance only as actors in preparatory dispensations, not as persons to be redeemed in the final dispensation. Premillennialist Dave Hunt, for example, wrote that modern Israel has many faults which we do not excuse or for which she will yet taste God's judgment. She is back in her land not because of her own merit, but because God is fulfilling his promises to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, as he wrote that he would in the last days. Even more illustrative of fundamentalism's tendency to view Jews in mythological categories is Arthur Bloomfield's contention that Hitler's policies toward the Jews were perfectly in keeping with God's use of this race. That is, the Holocaust was a just chastisement of a wayward race and a divinely directed step toward effecting the next dispensation. After all, Palestine could not support 20 million Jews, and therefore God had to see that the number of Jews was reduced before returning them to their homeland. Hitler helped make it clear to the Jews that they could be happy and live in peace only if they had their own nation, thereby helping create the restored Israel that would make it possible for Gentiles to receive their deserved eternal rewards. Christians should help protect Jews, Bloomfield warned. The reason for doing so, however, is not that it is morally noble or even politically prudent, but because their possession of Israel is a necessary precondition of the second coming. Apocalyptic belief, then, may take the form of patronizing affection for our Jewish friends, but it continues to perpetuate prejudice and spite. And moving forward in the text, at page 160, this particular section stood out with me because, yes, I am an interfaith minister. Denouncing world peace and interfaith unity. The Antichrist, has used many clever disguises in his effort to sneak by the vigilant eyes of prophecy students. But none has gone undetected. Knowing the essential character of the two beasts of Revelation, the tyrannical dictator supposed, and the false prophet, premillennial scholars have been quick to discern the Antichrist's presence in political institutions such as the League of Nations or the UN and its ecumenical religious organizations like the National Council of Churches of Christ. Beginning in the 1920s, the threat of Russia loomed sufficiently to set prophecy writers working overtime in their efforts to identify just who would soon emerge to fulfill the role of the Antichrist and oppose Russia. Gog, as depicted in the book of Ezekiel, in the quote-unquote final days. The chief contenders for the role were the fascist Italian leader Mussolini and the League of Nations created by Woodrow Wilson and others to bring peaceful resolutions to international conflicts. Mussolini was suggested principally because of this association with Rome, the center of the Antichrist Confederation, supposedly, that will rise to dominate the world in the end times. Now we're talking the 1920s, remind you. As early as 1925, premillennialist publications such as Prophetic News and Evangel alerted their leaders that they should be on the lookout for the revival of the old Roman Empire. Mussolini, Evangel warned, was the strongest character in world politics today, and his rise to power could mean nothing else than that the climax is near. Gerald Winrod's Mussolini's Place in Prophecy, 1933, reviewed all the biblical clues concerning the identity of the Antichrist and concluded that they all point to Mussolini. Prophetic interest in Mussolini died, however, with the onset of World War II and the demise of the Axis powers. Besides, the League of Nations and its successor, the United Nations, were much closer to home and thus directly associated with the drift of American culture towards the kinds of tolerance and pluralism despised by the Christian right. The formation of the League of Nations provoked an immediate response from premillennialist writers, whereas most Americans viewed the League as a rational attempt to find peaceful resolutions to world political crises and thereby prevent a reoccurrence of the devastation unleashed by World War I. Prophecy students knew otherwise. Writing in the Evangel, James McAllister summarized their feelings. Quote, "The world war thus originated by demon teachings has produced the result predicted in Revelation 16:14. It has gathered together all the kings of the earth and of the whole world. It has gathered them into a league of nations, which will become the preparation of the nations for Armageddon. The gathering or leaguing of the nations together is the signal that the end is in sight." The peace conference at Paris had unconsciously set the stage for Antichrist and Armageddon. Another fundamentalist tract, The King's Business, elaborated on the many ways in which the League of Nations fulfilled the prophecies of Daniel and Revelation. After learning that the League embodied the figure of iron and clay described in Daniel, readers were helped to understand that the man who will finally dominate the World League of Nations will be the political beast described in Daniel and in the book of Revelation. He is the Antichrist. Other writings of the era speculated that the two contenders for the throne of the Antichrist, Mussolini and the League of Nations, might soon converge, with the League providing the political institution through which Mussolini would grab hold of the despotic power of the Antichrist. After World War II, the UN assumed the Antichrist mantle formerly worn by the League of Nations, which was decommissioned. Like the League of Nations, the UN represented a cosmopolitan outlook that tried to embrace all of the world's diverse cultures. Although tolerance and pluralism may be useful traits for international diplomacy, they have fared poorly in the eyes of premillennialists. Separatism and loyalty to a narrowly defined cultural outlook are critical to the fundamentalist critique of modernism and all that it stands for. Thus, the ultra-conservative wing of American religion viewed the formation of the UN as an evil destined to end in the Antichrist's rule and its accompanying false religious order. In his article, How Antichrist Will Rule, Wilbur M. Smith maintained that the effort to create an international alliance of nations was destined to lead to the beast's dictatorship prophesied in Revelation 13. Writing in or for the King's Business, Louis Bowman predicted that when the Antichrist shall attain this power over the nations, then the whole world will become indeed United Nations, united in one great super government. Part of the fear of the United States' participation in the United Nations was that its national autonomy would be lost. Such a relinquishment of political independence would be nothing short of a betrayal of its mission as God's chosen nation. As Gerald L.K. Smith remarked, anyone who favored the U.S. membership in the UN was at once betraying the priceless heritage of the Founding Fathers and the true gospel of Christ. Of course, which was yielded by the fundamentalist right-wingers. Unfortunately, Smith realized seditious influences had already pushed the nation's leaders in this direction. Every member of Eisenhower's cabinet is for the UN. Its flag is the same color as the Jew-Palestine flag and is the same design as the Russian military banner. Our new president, that is Eisenhower, has paid tribute to this internationalist organization which promises no good for the future of America, as was perceived. It outlaws prayer and forbids anyone to mention the name of Jesus within its halls or within its sessions without the official disapproval of the United Nations as such. It represents the most expansive denial of Christ in an attempt to please the Antichrists in the history of the world. Known to premillennialists by such epithets as the alien, treasonable, anti-American Jew-United Nations, the UN's attempt to foster world peace represented just the kind of liberal rationalism the fundamentalism had to emerge to crusade against. So it would seem that fundamentalist Christianity thrives on creating enemies, real or imagined, for itself. Continuing, to Carl McIntyre, for example, even the peace symbol of popular among youth in the 1960s and 70s represented the insignia of the Antichrist. Americans needed to be waked up to the possible consequences of their continued participation in this quote-unquote godless organization. Billy James Hargis challenged all Bible-loving Americans to ask themselves, why should the United States, a Christian nation, take note of the United Nations, an Antichrist institution? The answer, of course, was that fundamentalist Christians had everything to lose if they abandoned their exclusivism and separatism for the kind of international pluralism represented by the United Nations. Or for that matter, I would add any type of interfaith theology, or any theology that would seem to support a more inclusivist or pluralist perspective. Continuing, efforts to promote religious tolerance and interfaith unity have been equally suspect in ultra-conservative circles. Throughout the 19th century, various Protestant denominations cooperated in the formation of voluntary societies aimed to alleviate social ills and to promote the gospel. In 1908, leaders of most of the major denominations worked collaboratively to establish the Federal Council of Churches, intended to bring churches together to deal with the social problems created by the growth of urbanization and industrialization. As such, the FCC was closely associated with the social gospel movements concerned with ministering to the needs of the poor. Specifics of theology were minimized in the effort to develop programs that could make a concrete difference in the lives of those who were without shelter, food, or proper medical care. In 1950, the FCC was reorganized as the National Council of Churches of Christ. For the last 4 decades of the 20th century, the NCC has acted as the nation's largest ecumenical organization, spearheading the church's effort to identify common theological ground among the major Protestant denominations and to apply Christian principles to contemporary social issues. All this, of course, has been offensive to fundamentalists who believe that the winning of individual souls, not the immoralization of society, is the sole duty of Christian ministry. Even more vexing is the general modernist spirit that has animates such ecumenical organizations. If Christian unity is to be achieved at the expense of unyielding adherence to important tenets of faith, such as biblical inerrancy or dispensationalist premillennialism, then it can and only lead to the kind of apostate religion prophesied in Revelation. Gerald Winrod knew that attempts to find common ground in religion are examples of Antichrist psychology. The so-called fellowship of faiths he heard modernist preachers calling for could lead nowhere else than to the world church, over which the second beast of Revelation 13 will preside. Carl McIntyre's weekly Christian Beacon carried an article by Southern preacher J. Harold Smith, who saw right through the FCC's facade of Christian love. The Federal Council, he warned, is no dove of gospel. It is instead a demonic vulture. The Federal Council of Churches of the Antichrist would make prostitutes of your daughters and libertines of your sons. This is the dirty, hellish gang of sects and devils that some of the Knoxville preachers are falling over themselves to defend. Leave this atheistic, communistic, Bible-ridiculing, blood-despising, name-calling, sex-maniacal gang of green-eyed monsters and hell-bound devils before God's judgment is poured out on them, quote unquote. hated of the values represented by the Federal Council of Churches, continued to build. Denounced for its atheism, immorality, pacifism, and support of civil rights, the FCC was everything that fundamentalists associated with godless communism. To combat the Antichrist apostasy that was being spread under the name of quote-unquote social Christianity, a group of ultra-conservative Protestants under the leadership of Carl McIntyre formed the American Council of Churches in 1941. Its mission statement captures well the over and againstness for which it was crusading, quote, to provide a pure testimony for fundamental churches to facilitate cooperation among true Christian churches, to project a united stand against religious modernism, to expose communist infiltration into the churches, to oppose every system alien to the Bible, or their version of Bible hermeneutics. It was, in short, intended to expose and oppose the supposed Antichrist rampant in the established Protestant denominations. The ecumenical mindset is one of universality, humility, and toleration. As such, it is antithetical to the quote-unquote true believer commitment that the Christian right asks from its adherents. When Gerald L.K. Smith called his followers to crusade against the onslaught of antichrists, plural, he spelled out the kind of militant piety this would require. Quote, absolute love for Jesus Christ, one that knows no fear, no compromise, no turning back, an absolute recognition on the part of God's children of their destiny in the world, and absolute identification of the perceived enemies of Jesus, and the willingness to pay the price of death, if need be, in order to resist the power and force and the satanic venom of those who would take the name of Jesus Christ out of this world. This zealous identification of the enemies of Jesus continued throughout the final decades of the 20th century, and I believe continues today. These so-called enemies, ultimately controlled and coordinated by the Antichrist, could assume clever disguises and appear in seemingly innocent attire, but the hunt for Antichrist has continued with the great success in even the most unlikely places in contemporary American culture. Advancing further to page 177, quote, it should be pointed out that popular culture has produced its own particular or peculiar fascination with the Antichrist. It would be hard to overestimate the influence that the American scriptural heritage concerning the Antichrist has had on Western culture's images of incarnations of evil, false messiahs, satanic influence, or catastrophic endings of the world. To some extent, evangelical Christians themselves have aided the translation of biblical topics into the vernacular of popular culture. Televangelists have popularized Christian eschatology over the same electronic media that bring science fiction into American homes. Evangelical movies such as A Thief in the Night, Image of the Beast, The Late Great Planet Earth, and The Road to Armageddon have also helped disseminate apocalyptic themes to wide audiences, but have done so at the great risk of losing the message to the medium. Are they being programmed? That is the question. Months after viewing Bible prophecy films, viewers have difficulty sorting out which images of evil are accurate depictions of biblical passages, which are dramatic embellishments of which have subsequently blended in their memories with scenes that were depicted in similar but non-biblical films produced by Hollywood. The Left Behind series, for instance, Hollywood capitalized on, as it saw dollar signs. Hollywood long ago discovered Americans' appetite for apocalyptic thrillers. David Seltzer's novel The Omen was successfully transformed into a box office success in 1976, and its sequels Damien II, The Final Conflict, 1978, 1981, and The Awakening, 1991, are the story of the birth and gradual rise to power of the so-called end-time ruler. Biblical accuracy, of course, gives way to dictatorial or directorial license. As Peter Malone shows in his book Movie Christ and Antichrist, Hollywood's Antichrist figures stay far afield of scriptural authenticity and connect inherited biblical images of evil with all sorts of popular fantasies concerning the incarnation of evil. Dracula, Frankenstein, Rosemary's Baby, demonic possession, The Exorcist, opening to the gates of hell, Amityville Horror, malevolent expressions of nature, The Birds, Jaws, Angels of Darkness, Psycho, and the technology of destruction, Dr. Strangelove, The Day After, The Terminator, 2001, A Space Odyssey. Much more fiction is concerned with the critique of W. Warren Wager calls terminal visions, beginning with the works of Mary Shelley, Edgar Allan Poe, and H. G. Wells. Western literature has displayed a preoccupation with the impending doom to be unleashed by biological, geological, or nuclear disaster. This literature, however, is usually less a product of biblical exegesis than that of a creative act of the secular imagination. Wager argues that the secular doomsday imagination reflects what might be termed a strategy of fear. Secular visions of the end, he says, express at least three separate layers of human fear. The first and most primitive layer contains fears of separation, power lessons, sexual rivals, loneliness, falling, and dying, according to Wager. Those most primitive human fears provide the dominant themes in religious apocalyptic writing because they are the most universal and, hence, least tied to conditions peculiar to any one specific historical era. Apocalyptic writing, originating from this level of primal emotion, satisfies the hunger of its readers for violence and death. As he explains, psychoanalytic theory suggests that such a hunger is no less part of the human condition than desire for life, love, and fulfillment through useful work. Destructive impulses are related originally to the same fears of powerlessness that nourish fantasies about heroically saving the world or surviving its supposed end. A sense of powerlessness can evoke all the devils of Tartarus: uncontrollable rage, bitter hatred, insatiable gluttony and lust, the desire to destroy supposed enemies and oppressors, self-loathing, and cravings for humiliation and death. We will have more to say about this later. We now note not only that contemporary apocalyptic thinking both religious and secular, is rooted in primal desires and fears expressed in the mythopoetic language of evil adversaries, reigns of lawlessness and terror, catastrophe, and final victory over one's supposed enemies. For him, a second layer in the strategy of apocalyptic fear is the dread of nature. Although fears of nature can be projections of psychological conflict, they are just as often prudent concerns about real menaces to life and health. Dangerous animals, violent storms, and destructive plagues are part of almost every generation's mythic imagination. The natural sciences have added a host of new fears to our own generation's sense of the precariousness of the human condition, from astronomy's discovery of the inevitable death of suns and their solar systems to microbiology's detections of deadly diseases. Secular apocalypses abound with new end times scenarios. Added to all this are the fears attending the growing awareness of the consequences of environmental recklessness, fears of the exhaustion of our natural resources, the depletion of the ozone layer, and the irredeemable or remediable pollution of our water supplies have found their way into modern novels, films, and song lyrics. In fact, Wager conjectures scientifically grounded theories of human vulnerability have largely transmuted older fears of the supernatural and the wrath of God into new secular forms. A third cluster of fears found in contemporary visions of the end center on what humans do to themselves. The modern apocalyptic imagination is easily inspired by stories of the mad and reckless scientist, accounts of the lethal effects of technology on the environment, or theories concerning the escalation of class, economic, or racial tensions into global war. The possibility of nuclear holocaust has given recent generations a vivid image around which to envision their imminent self-destruction, unlike the time of Daniel or Revelation, when only an act of God could terminate the whole creation in the twinkling of an eye. Contemporary Americans know full well that somewhere along the line they assigned this dreadful power to themselves. Barry McGuire's 1965 hit record, The Eve of Destruction, may have lacked explicit scriptural references, but it did express the contemporary secular fear that the end may indeed be imminent and that the only Antichrist to be named is ourselves. And that last statement aligns with the theory that Antichrist is no more or less than the collective ego in humanity, and not some end times dictator that would rise in power. In summary, and the final quote from this book, which is very, very enlightening. The act of naming the Antichrist has time and again promoted precisely this kind of tribalistic boundary posturing. It has made it possible to love one's family and religious community while hating all who are associated with said perceived Antichrist. Belief that Jews, Catholics, socialists, humanists, or feminists are in league with the beast has made the most uncivil behavior toward the social other a badge of piety and religious devotion. No doubt, the perception of disaster, relative deprivation, or technological backwardness all have contributed to the functional value of apocalyptic belief in distinguishing between in-group and out-group identity. I would like to draw attention, however, to the fact that all of these factors in predisposing persons to apocalyptic thought share something. Each points to what might be called a curtailed sense of agency. Western religious thought has since biblical times offered both a prophetic and an apocalyptic outlook on the world. Whereas prophetic thought places more emphasis on the role of humans in responding actively and responsibly to God's will, apocalyptic thought ascribes all decisive activity to God and his angelic forces and thereby offers hope even to a powerless or socially passive group. By its very nature, apocalyptic thinking grows out of and appeals to the sense of curtailed human agency. This is undoubtedly part of the reason that we witness such virulent Antichrist naming in the first half of the 20th century. Premillennial Christians realized that they were losing hold of the cultural center, no longer possessing the social clout to hold outside groups at bay. They resorted instead to the only weapon left in their meager arsenal, apocalyptic name calling. Naming the Antichrist created an ethic or ethnic identity for many white religiously ultra-conservative Americans. It served the adaptive function of demarcating all those who are to be considered out-group, but did so by separating premillennialists from precisely those trends of 20th century life that humanist scholars deem most likely to contribute to the progress of human life. The apocalyptic rhetoric of the naming the Antichrist has perpetuated intellectual outlooks that are functionally counterproductive. That is, the over and againstness of apocalyptic rhetoric has prompted large numbers of Americans to ignore the productive possibilities of modernist thought or interreligious dialogue, to remain mired in tribalistic prejudice, and to fail to reach out for a form of civil discourse that would help them become contributing members of a pluralistic and fully democratic society. The cultural situation for premillennialists changed slightly in the final decades of the 20th century. Whereas the problem of unbelief had formerly been the growing presence of unbelieving outsiders, the problem of unbelief in the latter part of the century became that of confronting elements of unbelief within themselves. Premillennialists have found themselves engulfed by foreign world and at times have found themselves tempted to defect to the technologies, entertainment, lifestyles, or academic standards that this foreign world has produced. It has been important, therefore, that apocalyptic imagery function in ways that erect boundaries that are more psychological than social in nature. That is, vigilance against the Antichrist not only legitimated hatred of those outside one's own tribe, but it also helps wall off one's own unacceptable thoughts and desires. This has been particularly true in the last few decades when the Antichrist has been variously located in ecumenical religious thought, modern computer systems, supermarket barcodes, fiber optics, the feminist movement, rock music, the European Economic Community, and the ecological movement. The obsession with these faces of the Antichrist has been a continuing struggle with what Richard Holsteiner termed the unacceptable aspects of the self. The act of naming the Antichrist has projected onto a demonic enemy the unacceptable tendencies that people refuse to recognize in themselves. It is the Antichrist, not themselves, who are responsible for the divided loyalties that plague them. With so many aspects of American life potentially luring individuals away from the premillennialist fold, it is no wonder that the Antichrist has been found camouflaging himself in diverse sectors of modern culture. A pragmatist interpretation of Antichrist imagery must be concerned with assessing whether this imagery functions to promote or hinder psychological health. It often seems that contemporary schools of psychology or psychological thought agree on very little, but on one thing they all are in accord. Psychological health requires the attainment and preservation of a fundamental sense of self-worth. What psychologists such as Erik Erikson, D.W. Winnicott, and Heinz Kohut showed in that this pursuit of self-worth begins early in infancy and is initially acquired through a certain rapport or communion with a nurturing parent. What Kohut terms the universal need for idealization and merger refers to the psychological necessity finding a higher other, such as the mother, from whom the infant can receive a sense of security and well-being. The infant comes to feel warm and prized largely through its merger with the higher being of the parent. This mirrored sense of worth gives rise to a healthy narcissism, that is, the earliest psychological ability to maintain a sense of being prized, cohesive self. As it grows older and thus more detached from the nurturing parent, it nonetheless continues to have a psychological need for feeling connected to a higher other, in relation to which it might sustain the sense of meaningfulness and self-worth. Religion and other idealized cultural values often fulfill this need. Psychologist of religion Peter Hamans notes perceptively that classical Protestantism has flourished largely owing to its ability to meet this fundamental psychological need for idealization and merger. The evangelical doctrine of the believer's oneness with Christ, I am in Christ and Christ in me, nurtures the believer's need for merger with an idealized higher other. In this way, evangelical belief satisfies important psychological needs in the lives of millions of contemporary Americans. Unfortunately, much of modern culture threatens the literal truth value of evangelical Christian belief and therefore jeopardizes many Americans' ability to idealize and merge with Christ, insofar as modern culture may sever people from their source of feeling prized and meaningful. It also may threaten to curtail their sense of agency. Modern culture has inflicted a sense of powerlessness on many Americans that is expressed in a host of emotions linked with apocalyptic rage, hopelessness, self-loathing, bitter hatred, victimization, and a desire to seek revenge on one's oppressors. No person or family can escape coming into contact with aspects of modern culture that entice them into defecting from the community of belief. The battle against unbelief, then, is not so much a battle against external groups who believe differently, but against one's own destructive inclinations. Any urge to affiliate with the surrounding world is accompanied by an internal battle of ontological proportions insofar as this urge simultaneously threatens to sever the self from its accustomed source of being worthy, valued, and loved. Persons of or environmental influences that prompt such inclinations understandably produce a considerable amount of dissonance and anxiety. These external influences are understandably perceived as threatening one's basic safety and organismic well-being. As psychologist Paul Prussayer observed, it is extremely interesting to note how frequently any beliefs partake of descriptive or explanatory imagery in which persons or persons-like entities are conjured up to convey their existential significance or cosmic meanings. The human mind becomes automatically mythopoetic when it has to contend with threatened or actual attack upon a person's organismic integrity. The apocalyptic heritage to which modern premillennialists are heir is adept at projecting such anxiety onto a mythic villain. The symbol of the Antichrist shapes an ontological reality congruent with these anxieties, and in so doing satisfies the believer's need to interpret the surrounding world. That is, humanistic education, rock music, ecumenical religions, hopes for world peace, as fraught with danger and deceit. The tyranny and deceit attributed to the Antichrist mirror the anxiety and self-loathing aroused by one's own continuing inclinations to jeopardize connections with the higher other of Christ. This is, I think, what literary critic W. Warren Wager had in mind when he suggested that the bedrock of apocalyptic thinking is primitive level of human emotion containing fears of separation, powerlessness, loneliness, and failing. The mythopoetic, language of evil adversaries, reigns of lawlessness and terror, catastrophe, and final victory over one's enemies is ultimately rooted in one's own primal fears and hungers, as he put it. Quote, destructive impulses, that is the urge to destroy the Antichrist, or perceived Antichrist, are related originally to the same fears of powerlessness that nourish fantasies about heroically saving the world or surviving its end. A sense of powerlessness can invoke all the devils. Uncontrollable rage, bitter hatred, insatiable gluttony and lust, the desire to destroy supposed enemies and oppressors, self-loathing, and cravings for humiliation and death. The point here is that psychological as well as sociological threats to our sense of agency and self-worth are likely to dispose us to apocalyptic as opposed to prophetic modes of religious discourse. To this extent, contemporary symbols of the Antichrist function in a way similar to what psychologist Melanie Klein called bad objects. Klein's clinical experience led her to conclude that obsessions with evil or hostile adversaries are typically projections of a person's own anxieties and impulses. She found that beginning in childhood, many of these emotions and impulses are so threatening that they must be projected onto the external world, and, unfortunately, onto numerous historical individuals. from Hitler to Stalin to Reagan, etc. That is, these destructive impulses are projected onto a variety of external persons or objects that are thereafter perceived as harsh and either superhuman or extraworldly. In this way, bad objects become the basis of a repetition compulsion involving a constant attempt to establish external danger situations that will mobilize a person against his or her own erring or destructive impulses. Modern images of the Antichrist provide a psychological symbol capable of constraining those errant tendencies that would otherwise serve or sever the self from continued merger with Christ. They do so, however, at a tragic price. Rather than strengthening people's own sense of responsible action, as does the prophetic core of the Judeo-Christian witnesses, apocalyptic imagery exacerbates the very conditions of curtailed agency that predispose person to it in the first place. It turns them away from the revelations open to the human intellect, away from community with the whole of God's creation, and away from activity designed to promote peace or goodwill across the earth. Those who engage in naming the Antichrist feel themselves exorcised of the demons of disbelief and consequently numbered among those who will be vindicated on the day of final reckoning. Like all obsessions, however, the naming of the Antichrist seeks to preserve the self by narrowing rather than engaging or enlarging its field of vision. The tragedy of this obsession is that it closes off believers from the possibility of finding an idealized or higher other, immanent in the world about them. Obsession with the Antichrist closes off persons from discovering the redemptive and wholeness-making possibilities of the many persons, ideas, and cultural activities that lie immediately before them. In religious terms, the obsession with Antichrist has channeled many Americans' desire to be loyal to God into hate-filled crusades, rather than into efforts leading to a deepened receptivity to or communion with the higher other, whether conceived as transcendent or immanent, in relation to which they know themselves to be inherently valued and prized. The history of the American Antichrist has proved to be a varied and fascinating one. It has revealed just how frail human existence can be, and how many people frequently cope with this futility by mythologizing life in apocalyptic ways. It appears that the sea of human insecurities is teeming with beasts that arise to threaten their social and psychological well-being. At times, these beasts have threatened the boundaries of their social or theological orthodoxy. At other times, they have ravaged the psychological boundaries that protect them from our own wayward inclinations. By mythologizing these threats, by naming the Antichrist, they seek to push back the threat of chaos, restore order, and secure their sense of agency and well-being. The historical record seems to indicate, however, that apocalyptic name-calling has rarely functioned in ways that lead to a productive engagement with life. Seldom have carriers of the Antichrist tradition acted in ways that demonstrably worked for a richer universe, for the good that seems most organizable, most fit to enter into complex combinations, most apt to a member of a more inclusive whole. In brief, this relentless obsession with Antichrist, or the Antichrist, appears to have done more to forestall than to signal the realization of the kingdom of God on earth. And with that, I will end this back cover book report by saying, be careful what you wish for, because you just might get it. That said, I will see you at the movies.